What's up, crew, and welcome to a very special game review of the Dallas 2024 One Piece Nationals. We have a Bonney mirror going into round 5 undefeated at this tournament. And you're blessed with a truly rare sight, my ugly face in the top right corner. I'm going to be going through this match, summing up all of my thoughts throughout the match, as well as make some comments about my own and Dylan's play during this game. The Bonney mirror, for those you don't know, is going to be a really slow matchup where both players should both be aiming to build out a really large board before slowly draining the opponent's resources in hand by swinging at characters on board. Now, most games, Bonney players will be playing out searchers to find their big bodies to build that large board. And as you can see, Dylan starts by playing a 1-cost Bonney here. In response, you'll see that I play a 1-cost Baby 5 and I search with it. And as I do so, I'm looking for that 10-cost Doflamingo, but ultimately don't find it and pick up a 0-cost event. Now, going back to Dylan's turn, Dylan searches with his Bonney and finds an 8-cost Kid and swings to remove my blocker. This is really typical in the early game since we want to remove all the blockers to prevent the searches for those big bodies before the Bonney ability is active to rest any of our characters that we managed to put on board. Now on my following turn, I'm able to swing out at the Bonney and kill it, and I'm able to establish my own Arouge. On the next turn, Dylan decides to attack my life on his 5-Don turn, which I think is really interesting. If Dylan had a Hody in hand at this point, I think I'd be pretty okay with this decision, but as you see later in the game, this isn't the case. But typically in the mirror, every early life that's taken just ends up being a card in hand for whenever you reach the mid-game phase and you're starting to swing at bodies. So him giving me this extra card is actually more to my benefit than to my detriment. So I'm not too sure why he decided to swing out at my face in this situation. Either way, he establishes his own Arouge and then passes. Now at this point, I play a Cavendish here to continue to build my board, and I do not swing at him at all as he has a Dawn active, and I don't want to leave any of my characters rested for him to swing at and for me to have to protect with cards in hand. Now, Dylan responds by playing a Hawkins and doing the same thing and passing. Now, at his 7-Don turn, this is where he could have played that Hody and made my life very difficult by forcing my cards to be rested and then forcing cards out of my hand by beginning to swing out. But because I got lucky and he didn't top deck or have Hody in the starting hand, he just plays a Hawkins and passes, and I'm able to continue to establish my game plan. Now at 8-Don, I established the 8-cost Kid, and as you notice, I forget to restand my Dawn with the Rouge at the end of the turn. This was a little bit of a mental mistake on my part during the tournament, but I think allowing Dylan to swing into me the following turn is actually beneficial, and you see that Dylan actually does swing into me with his leader, taking me down to 3 life. With an 8-cost Kid established, I'm not really worried about my life as a resource because I'm not going to be at risk of lethal for most of the game from now on, and every swing into my life is ultimately an extra card that I get to see and add to my hand. Now you see Dylan play the 8-cost Rosinante and rest it in order to play a 5-cost Cavendish. Now I personally don't play the 8-cost Rosinante because I think it hurts the consistency of the deck because there aren't as many 5-costs without the carrot. But I do know that this card helps improve your matchups against black like Lucci and ST Luffy. Now you see here Dylan is trying to decide whether or not to swing out with the Hawkins, and he ultimately decides not to, which I think is the correct decision, because ultimately that would just give me an extra card in hand to be able to play with. Now, for the first 10-Don turn of the game, I top deck a Rosinante blocker, which is incredibly lucky for me, and it lets me to play the second 8-cost Kid that I started with in hand, and use its ability to also summon the Rosinante. Then I replenish Dawn with Cavendish by swinging into his Rosinante. This is to prevent him from gaining cards from his life by letting that attack just fizzle out. And then I'm able to use that restood to Dawn to swing 12 at the Rosinante, truly starting the middle game phase of this game, where we just fight for board by continually swinging at everybody's rested bodies. Now with the 12k swing, he's going to want to prevent this attack by using as few cards as possible, which means he's probably going to expend his blocker, which he does by burning the Arouge. And then I'm able to restand one of my Dawn with my own Arouge and then pass. Now that is Dylan's 10 Dawn turn, and I have most of my board rested at this point. This is the second pivotal moment in the game, as Dylan can play his 10 cost Dofi and freeze a majority of my board, allowing him to gain a lot of tempo back. Now, Dylan in truth low rolled for his early game because he didn't see either a Hody or Dofi to play on curve, so he doesn't have it this turn. Now, that being said, Dylan does the next best thing by playing out his own 8-cost kid and passing with all of his characters active. This puts me in the first truly uncomfortable spot in this game, since, as I mentioned earlier, I don't want to give Dylan any cards at all from life. But passing and allowing him to draw a card for free also felt really, really bad for me in the moment. I was considering just using Kid's ability to rest him and not playing anything from hand, and then attaching a Dawn to him and passing so that he wouldn't be able to swing at life. And in retrospect, I think that this might have been the best play, since it prevented him from getting an extra card from life. But I think I ultimately decided that I wanted to progress the state of the game, which I think in retrospect is a bit of a mistake. And I swing 9 at his life, which then allows him to use his leader ability in order to rest my Arouge. And then he also takes the life. Now with my Arouge rested, I luckily have one in hand, so I rest for Dawn and I replace the Arouge, allowing me to have a standing blocker, which I can use for future attacks. Now, the reason why I think that this was a mistake is that because I attacked, I gave Dylan an extra card, while also being forced to spend one of my own in order to replace the rested Arouge, which means that Dylan was able to go up 1 in his hand size, and I was forced to go down 1 in hand size, when ultimately that didn't really need to happen at this stage of the game. And now, it's back to Dylan, and the true mid-game begins. Dylan begins to swing out at my kid to remove as much counter from me as possible. He does this with 2 10k swings and an 8k swing with his Hawkins. Dylan is able to do, when Dylan does this, he's able to get 3 cards out of my hand as well as a blocker. At this point in the game, Dylan has 6 Dawn left, so he has a bit of a decision to make. What to do with the rest of his Dawn. What he ultimately decides to do is play a baby 5 searcher and use it to continue to look for cards. I think he's looking really primarily for the 10 cost Dofi at this point, because I don't think he has one in his hand at this point in the game. Ultimately he doesn't find one, but he does find the 2 cost Rosinante blocker, which he picks up. And then with his remaining Dawn, he does that 9k swing, or his 8k swing that I was referring to earlier, and then uses the 2 remaining Dawn to play out that blocker Rosinante that he just picked up with the baby 5, and then pass. Now, at this point in the game, I'm really fortunate to have 2 10 cost Dofis in hand, one of which came from the second life that he swung at me, which kind of just highlights the point of not giving cards in the earlier game. Now this allows me to reclaim all the tempo that I may have lost at this point in the game by freezing his board and then slowly beginning to remove cards from hand. When I play the first Dofi, I have a bit of a decision to make in terms of which cards I want to freeze. I ultimately opt to freeze the Kid, the Rosinante, and the Hawkins, and leave the Cavendish to become active again. Now, the reason I did this is because he didn't play a Dofi on his 10 Dawn turn, it's pretty unlikely that he'll play one on his following turn. And additionally, even if he does play the 10 cost Dofi, I want to make sure that he isn't able to swing at anything effectively, which he would be able to do if I left, say, the Kid or the Rosinante up. So by resting the Hawkins, the Rosinante, and the Kid, even if he plays the Dofi and is able to get back 2 more Dawn, I'm not that concerned because I have the second Dofi in hand, and ultimately I don't lose any resources on the turn that he plays the 10 cost Dofi. Now on Dylan's following turn, this is where I think he makes the biggest mistake of the game. So because he doesn't have the 10 cost Dofi, which I expected, he ends up playing a Hawkins and swinging 10 with Cavendish, which is perfectly fine. This is another way to attempt to get more cards out of hand. I use the Arouge blocker to block the attack, but when he restands the 2 Dawn with the Cavendish effect, he chooses not to put a Dawn under his kid. Now I'm not too sure what the reasoning of this is, since a Hody would allow me to rest both of his Dawn even if he left 2 up, so I'm not really sure what he was attempting to play around. It could be as simple as he forgot to put one under the kid, very similarly to how I forgot to restand my Dawn with Arouge. Either way, not having a Dawn on the kid allows me to have a free 10k swing into the Cavendish, which eliminates a lot of pressure, because even if Dylan draws a 10 cost Dofi at some point in the game, since the Cavendish is gone, he won't be able to restand any Dawn on the turn that he plays that Cavendish, which for me relieves a lot of pressure. That being said, I do have the Dofi because I high rolled this game, and I'm able to freeze him out for a second time. So a really interesting decision is that when I swing with the first 10 cost Doflamingo, Dylan has a choice whether or not to rest my Cavendish or my 8 cost kid. Now some of you might be wondering why he didn't rest my Cavendish, given that I played the 10 cost Dofi and was able to restand Dawn with my Cavendish. But you have to understand that from Dylan's perspective, he doesn't really know if I have the 10 cost Dofi, and it's way more detrimental to him in the cases where I don't have the 10 cost to leave 2 8 cost kids up to pitch more counter out of his hand whenever I swing into his large bodies. At this point in the game, Dylan should be prioritizing keeping his bodies on board at all costs, especially his larger bodies. So if I had swung large with both of my kids, he would have been forced to remove basically all the cards in his hand in order to preserve his board state. So by resting the 8 cost kid, he makes it so that he has to pitch significantly less counter in order to achieve the same goal. And in the case where I do have the 10 cost Dofi, he's already going to have an entire board rested, so the extra standing Dawn isn't even that significant. Now Dylan, still not drawing a 10 cost, is forced to swing 9 with lead and then play a 5 cost Bonney to freeze one of my Dofis and try to buy some time. Now the following turn, I opt to swing 14 at kid, since Dylan still has 5 cards in hand. Given that he wasn't able to play a big body for the past 3 turns, I'm fairly confident that his hand is probably mostly 2Ks, which means that because I'm swinging 14 into an 8, it means that he will have to use a minimum of 4 cards to save this kid, leaving only 1 in hand. If Dylan decided to do this, even if he did have all 2Ks in hand, it would essentially cause him to lose on the spot, because then I would just swing 7, 7, 10 into his remaining bodies, which would mean that he'd either lose his entire board, or he would go to 0 cards in hand and still lose most of his board, which is effectively a death sentence. So, given that Dylan correctly allows his kid to die, I can pivot. Now that I have the massive board advantage of not having to worry about the kid and not having to swing at that kid every single turn, I can now focus on trying to remove his hand advantage. And I'm able to do that by swinging 7 at the Hawkins with both Cavendish and my lead, which forces him to remove 1 card from hand each. And then I'm able to swing 10 at Hawkins, which then puts him in the exact same spot where if he decides to save it, he basically removes his entire hand, or he has to get rid of the body. Now, at this point in the game, Dylan actually draws into his first Dofi, and now this gives him the first real chance to make a comeback in this game. And he also does the incredibly smart move of leaving all of his characters active once again. And this puts me back into the very similar awkward situation of having to decide whether I want to swing at his life and give him resources to potentially come back into the game. Now at this point in the game, my hand is an 8 cost kid, a 2k counter, a 5 cost Bonney, and a blocker Rosinante. And I decide if I'm going to be forced to take Dylan's life, the worst case scenario for me is that he finds another 10 cost Tovi and can chain it, because then that would give him another turn to potentially swing back the game. And because I have so few cards in hand, I'm basically running out of gas to be able to protect my board. So what I decide to do here is I decide to swing 5k with my lead first, before spending any of my Dawn, to probe if Dylan is willing to counter out and reduce his hand size at any point. If Dylan already had the second Dofi in hand, I expect that he would counter out of the 5k in order to give him that extra life to help him swing back the game. But when Dylan takes the 5k swing, it kind of indicates to me that he doesn't have the 10 cost Dofi, but also it means that if I swing 7 or 9, he's basically forced to take both swings or be really inefficient with his counter, because instead of spending 1 card to block the 5, he now has to spend 2 for the 7 or 3 for the 9. So he's forced to take all 3 lives, which takes him down to 1. So now he's at 1 life and has 6 cards in hand again. In order to prevent him from back-to-back 10 cost Dofiing, I decide to remove my Cavendish and play the 5 cost Bonney, freezing one of his Dawn. And then in order to prevent him from being able to clear most of my board, I then remove the Bonney to play the 2 cost blocker Rosinante. Now at this stage in the game, I'm not really worried about having the extra 6k body on board. I'm more concerned about preserving my 8 cost kids and my 10 cost Dofis. And basically, I don't have the cards in hand to really keep playing big impactful units, so the Cavendish restand 2 is becoming less and less significant at this point in the game. Now, with only 9 Dawn, Dylan is kind of forced to swing out at my board, which he does, and he has another Hawkins blocker in hand, which he plays in order to prevent him from dying to lethal. And now this follow-up turn, where I still have 2 8-cost kids and 2 10-cost Dofis, is where I think I make potentially the worst mistake of the game. So when I decide to swing out at Dylan, I basically know at this point I'm only going to be swinging at his face the entire turn. Because he's only at 1 life, there's really good chance of lethal, and me swinging out at any of his bodies, if he can counter out of the 5k swing at his life, he can definitely counter out at any swing at any of his units. So just to be most card optimal and counter optimal, I have to be swinging at his face. Now it's just a decision of how much I should be swinging. What I ultimately decide is to swing 11 with Dofi, 7 with my lead, and then 11 with both of my kids, because he's going to rest my second Dofi with his leader effect. Ultimately, I think that this was a huge miscalculation, because my only goal for this turn is to maximize the amount of counter value that I'm removing from his hand. With the way that I sequenced it out, he's obviously going to take the life with the first 11 Dofi swing, and then when I swing with 7k, I'm able to get 2 cards out of his hand and 3k in counter value. Now with the first 11k kid swing, he's able to block with the Hawkins, and then with the second one, he's able to counter out with 7k in counter value, with 3 2ks and 1 1k. So this results in him losing 6 cards from hand with a total of 10k in counter value, leaving him with 2 in hand. Now, if I had done this optimally, what I would have done is I would have swung 10k across the board. And if I had done this, he still likely would have taken his life with the first 10k swing. And then with the second 10k swing, he would have had to lose 6k in terms of counter value. And then with the second swing, he would have lost another 6k in counter value. And then with the final 10k, he would have blocked with his Hawkins, which means that he would have lost 2 additional k in counter value. And this is really significant because you can see after my particular sequence, he has 2 cards in hand, one of them being a 2k and one of them being a Rosinante blocker. If I had swung optimally, he would have lost the 2k at a minimum. And this is really important because he has 2 cards left in hand. One is a Rosinante blocker and one is a 2k. Ultimately, the reason why this is really significant is because Dylan top decks a Baby 5 Searcher. Now, what Dylan decides to do here is search with his Baby 5 Searcher, and if he had found another 2-cost Rosinante blocker, this match could have very easily swung back in Dylan's direction. Because at this point in the game, I have no counter in hand. I have an 8-cost Kid and a 9-cost Zoro in hand. And if he had seen another 2-cost block, he could play both blockers and then ultimately prevent lethal for the following turn, guaranteed. But when Dylan whiffs the Baby 5 Search, he has no more lines to prevent lethal and he concedes. This was an incredibly fun and close match between Dylan and myself, and huge props to him for making an amazing Nationals run after this game. I had an incredibly fun time playing with him on stream, and I really hope you enjoyed this match review. If you liked it, leave a comment and let us know what you think. And as always, Thanks for watching.